From the historic flop that is Concord to the controversial PS5 Pro presentation, the past few weeks for PlayStation have been very challenging. And even though these aforementioned setbacks can be attributed to PlayStation misinterpreting the climate of the gaming industry and the wants of the audience, I think it's deeper than that. I say this because prior, when the PS4 generation was led by Shawn Layden and Shuhei Yoshida, it's inarguable that PlayStation was on a remarkable trajectory as they solidified themselves as a dominant leader of the gaming industry and proved that they could consistently provide quality award-winning first-party games.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
However, in 2019, when Layden and Yoshida were replaced by Jim Ryan and Hermen Hulst, things started to change at PlayStation. The output of high-caliber first-party games lessened, and there was a massive push for live service games. So, with the new leadership and new initiatives, I'm inclined to believe that the PlayStation we once revered in previous generations is gone, and in its place is a more avarice, Apple-like company that is less concerned about the art of gaming and more concerned about how they can profit from it. When I look back at the PS3 and PS4, one thing that I remember so fondly about those generations was the variety of first-party games. From the cinematic AAA games like God of War, Uncharted, and Infamous, to the more niche and experimental games like Gravity Rush, The Last Guardian, Journey, and Little Big Planet, there was something for everyone to experience. But once Jim Ryan became CEO of PlayStation in 2019, everything changed.
Jim Ryan's live service plan crash and burn, Bungie decline, and most recently Concord do immense damage. And we may think that's mostly financial damage. Literally, it is. But in truth, I think it's actually far worse. What it did is it broke the seal of approval. It shattered their own version of Nintendo's famous seal of quality. The idea that they are tastemakers, that got broken because they just served up something that people didn't like. So even when we have Astrobot, an absolutely stunningly good game, it should be a free win, what it ends up doing is psychologically highlighting the contrast between the old school, the inventive, Japan-led Sony, and the bumbling live service movie game Sony, characterized by more recent American leadership. Or to put it in other terms, once you become president or prime minister, it's often only downhill from there.
See, for the first few years of the PS5, the roster of first-party games were exceptional. We got Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Spider-Man Miles Morales, Spider-Man 2, God of War Ragnarok, and Returnal. But even though Jim Ryan was the CEO at this time, he shouldn't be credited for PlayStation's early success. Instead, the credit should be attributed to Shawn Layden and Shuhei Yoshida, as they were the ones who led PlayStation to develop the games that would result in the PS5's remarkable early years. But the reason as to why I'm highlighting the PS5's early success and those responsible for it is to contrast the state of PlayStation before Jim Ryan and the state currently. Now, from 2021 to 2022, which I will term the Layden era, we got Returnal, Ratchet & Clank, Destruction All-Stars, Horizon Forbidden West, Gran Turismo 7, and God of War Ragnarok. And from 2023 to now, the Jim Ryan era, we got Spider-Man 2, Helldivers 2, Concord, and Astrobot. So by comparison, the last 2 years of PlayStation have worsened when it comes to the quantity and quality of first-party exclusives. But you may be wondering, what about exclusives like Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, Rise of the Ronin, and Stellar Blade? Surely, Jim Ryan should get credit for those games. Well, although this is true, I can't acknowledge them the same way I do PlayStation's first-party games, because for one, these games are available on PC or are coming to PC. And secondly, the fact that Jim Ryan has to rely on second and third-party deals with companies outside of PlayStation to make the PS5 more appealing, instead of just making great games in-house, shows that PlayStation's first-party output has weakened under Jim Ryan. And what's worse is that, if you look at PlayStation's future, it doesn't look promising either. For example, we know Sucker Punch is working on Ghost of Tsushima 2, and that Naughty Dog is working on The Last of Us Part 3 and a new IP. But besides those announcements, we haven't seen anything. Therefore, with the very few and infrequent updates, it stands to reason as to why PlayStation fans look at its future unconfidently. And if we do look at the games PlayStation has released recently, they give us more reason for us to be wary. As soon as Jim Ryan became CEO, he made it clear that PlayStation's new focus was to capitalize on the trend of live service games. And in my opinion, this is perhaps the worst thing Jim Ryan could have done for PlayStation. For starters, PlayStation announced that for their new initiative, they were developing 12 live service games and hoped that out of those dozen, a few would be big hits. However, Sony's senior vice president Hiroki Totoki announced in November 2023 that PlayStation was going to reduce their efforts from developing 12 live service games to 6 because of quality control issues. Moreover, PlayStation also acquired Bungie for $3.6 billion for their expertise to instruct their first-party studios to develop live service games. Initially, this would seem like a smart move for PlayStation, as Bungie is a very talented studio with a legacy of iconic games like Halo and Destiny. And they were in development of a new IP called Marathon. So on paper, this deal seemed genius. However, PlayStation would regret their decision to buy Bungie, as it turns out that despite Destiny 2's perceived success, Bungie has been struggling financially for years. Thereby, in hindsight, PlayStation's acquisition of Bungie was actually Bungie deceiving PlayStation to buy them out of their financial troubles.
That Sony acquired back in July 2022 for $3.6 billion, and that was for their live service expertise, and also Bungie would, at the time, stay as an independent subsidiary, and they were not part of PlayStation Studios proper. But now that might be changing based on the financial turbulence that Bungie has been experiencing, because in October 2023 they did a mass round of layoffs, and now this past Wednesday they confirmed more layoffs were happening immediately.
On the time needed to ensure both projects deliver at the quality our players expect and deserve. We were overly ambitious, our financial safety margins were subsequently exceeded, and we began running in the red. Basically, poor planning, poor leadership, and foresight that was non-existent. Basically, a complete lack of what they're trying to discover now, realistic goals and viable financials.
Billion with a B. Bungie CEO Pete Parsons purchased over 20 classic cars in online auctions costing millions of dollars. Hey, you know what? That's fine. As long as you don't lay off your staff, I'm fine with that. You made a valuable product, you sold it for a lot of money, you should be rewarded. According to his account on the website, he continued buying them even after mass layoffs at the studio.
It's just a mess, man. It's crazy how this is playing out, especially for where Bungie is and maybe the lies they were portraying to Sony to get acquired. And now Sony's just like cleaning this whole mess up. And it's like, do we really want Sony to operate Bungie? I still feel it's something where it's like, well, they wanted you for the talent. Now they have to figure out how to foster that properly when they did not know how to do that, and that's why they picked up Bungie.
But Bungie's strain on PlayStation doesn't end there. See, because PlayStation relied on Bungie's expertise to make live service games, PlayStation gave Bungie creative authority over their first-party studios, which is a decision that would cause development hell for PlayStation's games. For example, one casualty from the Bungie acquisition was the cancellation of the highly anticipated Factions 2 by Naughty Dog. And with Naughty Dog's track record of developing quality multiplayer experiences with the multiplayer modes of Uncharted 2 to 4 and The Last of Us Part 1, it's reasonable to believe that Factions 2 would have been a great game. But despite Naughty Dog's track record and talent, Bungie deemed Factions 2 as unsuitable, and eventually, production for the game ended. Now, we don't know why Bungie disapproved of Factions 2, but there's been speculation that the reason Bungie found Factions 2 not up to snuff was due to it not being viable enough for microtransactions. Now, these are just rumors, but with Bungie's track record, I'm inclined to believe them. But regardless, the cancellation of Factions 2 means that Naughty Dog wasted 3 years of development and had nothing to show for it, which must be a hit to these developers' morale. But Naughty Dog is not the only studio at PlayStation frustrated by Jim Ryan's mandate, as it's been reported that many other employees are unhappy with it as well, which makes sense because most PlayStation studios specialize in single-player games, but are now forced to develop games outside of what they're used to. So with that being said, it's possible that some employees may harbor resentment towards Jim Ryan. So, with an unruly CEO and crazy mandates, surely everything would work out fine for PlayStation, right?
Concord cost about $400 million to make.
This game was barely advertised. It was a generic slop hero shooter with character design that probably rivaled that of my actual doodles in kindergarten.
This game lasted, what, 2 weeks? 2 weeks? This is, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this.
PlayStation announced that they would be taking live service hero shooter Concord offline less than 2 weeks after the game's official launch.
Yeah.
This is huge.
The biggest high-profile flop
That was really
of all time.
Concord is the future of PlayStation.
Concord is a game that took 8 years of development and that PlayStation put hundreds of millions behind in hoping it would become a big success. Unfortunately, PlayStation's multi-million-dollar bet on Concord turned out to be its biggest failure in recent history. But what makes this situation worse for PlayStation is that they bought Concord studio Firewalk last year, which means a year before release, Jim Ryan and Hermen Hulst saw this product and believed in it so much that they were willing to buy its studio to gain exclusivity. And because of Concord's bombing, it exposes Jim Ryan's poor judgment as a CEO and how he's out of touch with the gaming industry. But Concord's failure is not an isolated incident. PlayStation squandered 2 more live service games with Foamstars and Helldivers 2. Foamstars was a live service game that was a joint venture between PlayStation and Square Enix, and many deemed it to be a Splatoon clone. However, unlike Splatoon, Foamstars failed to attract an audience and was dead on arrival. Helldivers 2, on the other hand, was a huge success. But PlayStation couldn't help themselves and got overzealous when they demanded PC players to require a PSN account to access the game. Now, this didn't go well with consumers, as a PSN account wasn't required to access Helldivers 2 before PlayStation's request, which means that customers who bought the game and didn't have a PSN weren't granted access to a game they already bought. And even worse, customers from countries that can't access the PSN couldn't access Helldivers 2 at all. So after many complaints were made, PlayStation retracted their malpractice, but the damage was already done. And the enthusiasm Helldivers 2 once had dissipated. Therefore, with Factions 2's cancellation, both Concord and Foamstars being dead on arrival, and Helldivers 2's decline, it's safe to say that PlayStation's live service initiative has been nothing but a total disaster. And conveniently, right before the disaster struck, Jim Ryan announced in September 2023 that he was going to retire and leave his position at PlayStation in March 2024. Coincidence? I don't think so.
One reason I never really connected with Jim Ryan, besides the fact he looks like an alien wearing a human mask, is because he's not a gamer, he's a businessman. And I think that reflects in Sony's approach to this generation. And instead of what we saw with like the PlayStation 4 generation, where the approach was super high quality single player games, now it seems like the approach is do that too, but let's focus on really trying to build out live service games and multiplayer games with microtransactions and stuff. And I don't like that.
But to be honest, Jim Ryan's mandate was stupid to begin with. This is because the live service multiplayer genre is already oversaturated. From Fortnite, Apex Legends, Valorant, Warzone, Overwatch, Roblox, etc., the space is highly competitive to begin with. So, if PlayStation wanted to compete competently, they'd have to realize they'd be facing an uphill battle. For example, games like Fortnite, Apex, and Overwatch require a lot of their players' commitment, time, and money. And because of the dedication required to play these live service games, it is highly unlikely that the average gamer engages in more than a few of them. Which means, in order for PlayStation to be successful in this space, they'd have to reach a new audience of live service gamers, which is hard to do because the genre is so saturated. Or, they'd have to poach players from already well-established live service games, which is also hard to do as some of PlayStation's competitors have had dedicated fan bases for close to a decade.
Comparing Concord to Helldivers 2, like head-to-head, I think you misunderstand fundamentally the difference. Helldivers 2, there isn't really a competitor to compare it to. And that's part of the reason it did so well, because people saw footage of Helldivers 2 and they're like, ooh, this is different, I like this. And I haven't seen a game like this before. But on the flip side, Concord, there are many games that are comparable. Even just the most obvious, which is like Overwatch, but even like an up-and-coming one like Marvel Rivals, those are free to play. Again, Concord needed to win over Overwatch players. It needed to win over the people that are excited for Marvel Rivals. But it was doing that and being like, okay, you guys are playing the game for free? Well, give us $40, and then we'll try to convince you that we're worth $40.
All this to say, Jim Ryan was clearly out of his depths when he implemented his mandate. It was an impulsive move made to exploit a trend and profit from it. And because of his greed, Jim Ryan's plan blew up right in his face. Last but certainly not least, we have the PS5 Pro. Now my first thoughts regarding this console was, why does it exist? And when I look online, I realize that I'm not alone in this sentiment. See, the major issue with the PlayStation's presentation of the PS5 Pro was that it failed to convey to the audience its value. And one reason for this issue is due to the lack of killer apps PlayStation has to convince us why do you want to upgrade to the PS5 Pro. By comparison, when the PS4 Pro was revealed in 2016, Infamous Second Son, Until Dawn, and Uncharted 4 were already out. Also, we knew in the following years, Horizon Zero Dawn, Spider-Man, and God of War were to release. So, because of the already released PS4 games and the upcoming PS4 games, there was an incentive to upgrade to the PS4 Pro. And on top of that, the PS4 Pro was sold at the old PS4 price at $399, and the price of the new PS4 Slim reduced to $299. However, when it comes to the PS5 Pro, there are no killer apps to make it seem enticing. Instead, they show the PS5 Pro running The Last of Us Part 2, a PS4 game, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. And even in these instances, the improvements shown from the PS5 to PS5 Pro was hardly noticeable.
It looks promising, but it wasn't necessarily shown off as well as it could have been, is I kind of think the takeaway here.
Yeah, I think so. I think, we just need to get some good trailers out there that actually show the difference, where somebody's putting in the effort to show the difference. But the question is whether Sony actually wants that from their perspective. It's
right.
It's kind of weird.
I'm hearing you with very apparent visual upgrades. Whoa! That sounds expensive. What about marginalized visual upgrades? Okay, yeah. I don't know, which one is the Pro version?
There is so much detail lost in the performance mode on the base PS5, where you can see detail levels in the glass is just gone. You can't even read the signs that are on the watchtower, whereas on the PS5 Pro, you can actually make out Fedra. You can see much more detail in the windows. They've been able to crank the mesh quality as well. Other things like the barbed wire around here is just completely lost in the PS5 performance mode, whereas over here, it actually renders it all the way through. So there definitely is a difference. And I gotta give them credit for that, because there is a difference. But whenever you're trying to justify an expensive hardware upgrade, if I have to pause the video and zoom in and look for it, I'm starting to think maybe the improvements are not that clear or not that overwhelming.
And for all that, PlayStation is selling the PS5 Pro for $700 USD without a disc drive or stand. Now, I know the PS5 Pro is supposed to be a premium product that is completely optional. And if PlayStation has convinced you to buy one, good for you. But for me personally, because of the lack of killer first-party exclusives, barely noticeable improvements, and $700 price tag, $960 here in Canada, the PS5 Pro is unappealing. Although the recent actions by PlayStation have been controversial, we all know that the reason why they made them and why they will get away with them is because of the lack of competition. With the decline of Xbox, it's clear that in the home console space, PlayStation now has a monopoly. There is Nintendo, but because of its limited hardware, it's not able to receive the same amount of third-party games PlayStation can get, which gives them the advantage. And also, Nintendo is not really a direct competitor to PlayStation like Xbox is, because since the Switch is a handheld hybrid, they cater to a different audience. So, will PlayStation ever get back to its glory days of amazing first-party exclusives and appreciating their fans with events like PlayStation Experience? Probably not. PlayStation won the console race, and there's no one to stand in their way. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What do you think of PlayStation's live service games, and are you a fan of the PS5 Pro or not?